we are dealing now not necessarily with the Khmer Rouge and Hitler or Stalin. We're dealing with a more sophisticated ruling clique, satisfying the nuances, the demand for freedom and democracy in the West, having a facade of democratic reforms, trying, in many cases, employing vast influential public relations establishment to influence the Congress, EU Parliament, to prove that they are on the road to democracy. We have heard about Burma. After all, the military junta in Burma now is committed to conduct what they term as free and fair elections. But this is, to me, a major challenge, more insidious in a sense, because they perpetrate the same atrocities, crime, in the name of democracy. They will conduct fair and free elections, but the elections are never fair nor free. They will have what is called as an independent judiciary, but the judiciary judges are in the thumbs of the executive. They talk about free media. They would allow some access to the internet because they know the internet will have limited penetration, particularly in the rural heartland. So we are dealing now with a more sophisticated bunch of corrupt members of the ruling clique. Now I represent a force in the country, in Malaysia, trying to deal with a more insidious ruling elite bent on perpetrating the power of the establishment. The ruling party has been there since independence in 1957 from the British. They realized that they would have to give an approval and assent to virtually all resolutions in favor of human rights, democratic reforms. But they fail in any measure the test scrutiny in terms of their commitment to these reforms. We have difficulty, therefore, to try and impress our friends, except those in the civil society, those who not only harper and clamor for reform, but actually struggle to implement these reforms. I've never regretted what my clamor for reform, demand for change, suffered twice. Initially, first 2 years when I was very young, under the Internal Security Act, detention without trial, and then again 6 years of solitary confinement. But after going through the entire, what is termed as due process, with hand-picked judges, then badly assaulted to near death, on my first night in the prison cell by the Inspector General of Police. So my remark, they say, if at all you attain power, make sure that the Inspector General of Police is not someone very strong, so that in case he decides to beat you up, it's not too fatal. They say we have freedom of speech. We have prime ministers and leaders going around the world. Malaysia, like many other Asian countries, respect the freedom of speech. My response to that, yes, we have the freedom of speech, but we've never had freedom after speech. You do it at your own peril, because you have Internal Security Act. Now, what is the problem, therefore, in trying to ensure that these countries actually observe basic, fundamental rules respecting human rights, freedom, and democracy? Malaysia is a multiracial, multi-religious country. Yes, we attained independence. The indigenous people, the majority, were Muslims, so Islam is the religion of the federation. But the constitutional guarantees of religious freedom is very clear. Similarly, when we talk about the national language or economic policies. But in any reform, from my limited experience, working both in the government and dismissed, imprisoned, is to ensure that these fundamental guarantees must be well explained, not in terms of slogan or human rights or freedom or democracy, because I've seen my engagement with many of our Western friends in Europe or in the States, anyone that used this term would naturally be readily embraced. So we will have to test some of these issues to be made abundantly clear. Issues of freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, the rule of law, the respect for human rights, and economic policies that should necessarily promote growth, but must ensure this distributive justice, because we have abject poverty in many of our countries. Now, our neighbor, Indonesia, is a classic example that a transformation into a vibrant democracy is possible. It is the largest Muslim country in the world. So all this discussion that we hear in Washington, London, and many capitals of Europe about the issue of incompatibility between Islam and democracy, this stems from clear either prejudice or ignorance of history and historical antecedents and experience. Indonesia started off as a democratic nation, only to be hijacked, in the case of Indonesia, not by the so-called Islamists, but by the secularists, the nationalists. We have experienced democratic experiment in Iraq, in Syria, in many of these countries. But what is, to my mind, a major transformation, major in Indonesia, the experience is, as the largest Muslim country in the world, conducting free and fair elections. I remember Al Gore's comment that the elections they had after the reformasi, the reform movement in Indonesia, was far more free and democratic than Florida in the year 2000. And I can't disagree with Al Gore at that point. But this proves that if you build institutions, the judiciary, the Anti-Corruption Commission, the free media, a fair and free election commission, then you can actually manage the affairs even of Muslims that's being questioned. In Indonesia again, although I'm supposed to talk about Malaysia, the experiment is, to my mind, very critical, because this is one of the few countries that allow freedom of all political parties and of religious persuasions to participate in the elections, including the Islamic parties calling for the establishment of an Islamic state. But if you have a free media, you allow them and the society to engage in a vibrant discourse, you should not and cannot prejudice the possibility of any group to participate. Immediately you'll be seen to be trying to implement a system according to the dictates of the West. But once freedom is enjoyed, you have a vibrant discourse, then and the elections is free and fair, you have vast majority of Muslims deciding and opting for a moderate democratic path and reject the Islamic Party and the extremists. Now this sort of engagement and discourse is somewhat absent, even among my colleagues in the Middle East, because somehow or other the debate between the Islamists and the secularists becomes so contentious that if one takes over, then they would deny the possibility of the other group to participate. The Indonesian experience, which is to my mind again critical, is because it's democratic and it allows for participation by all only after you build and strengthen the institutions of governance. Now, in the case, back to Malaysia, we are of course facing encountering problems, partly because leaders change and come and go, but the system remains the same. We still have draconian laws introduced initially by the British against militant communist activity, but now used against political opponents, unions, student leaders. Not as much, hardly dozens have been arrested, but the culture and climate of fear is prevalent by the presence and the use or potential of this threat of use of the Internal Security Act. Media is completely controlled by the ruling establishment because we have, you need to have a license for television or radio or newspapers. A license will be only issued to cronies or the ruling establishment. Now, now that I'm here, I've been tweeting that I'm here in Oslo, and immediately the response by the ruling establishment is that, look, Anwar now soliciting foreign support, he's an anti-national, he's going to Oslo to attack the country. He's not attacking the corrupt establishment. Once you criticize a policy, then you are now an anti-national. The most popular, of course, I am a Jewish agent, and the last attack during the by-election is that I am a, the term is not an agent of Israel, but a stooge of Israel. And I'm quite strong, my view, against the crimes against the Palestinians, but that's besides the point. You can see, and the entire media was used. And photographs issued, my photo, seen to be Soros or Paul Wolfowitz or Bob Rubin or Madeleine Albright or the Jewish names. And once the media are fully controlled by the government, there's no way you can counter these arguments, excepting for going down to talk to them. And I don't take it necessarily on an apologetic view. I say, yes, they are my friends, they're my good friends. And of course, my line would be, I befriend the good Jews and the good Muslims, you befriend the bad Jews and the bad Muslims. But still, that's a very, very arduous task in trying to present your case against the odds or an absolute control of the media. Now, what is that necessarily a problem that seems somewhat unsurmountable? No. Despite all this control, in the last general elections, with all this flawed election process, we were able to control the majority of seats in Peninsular Malaya. We lost in the rural heartland, in the Borneo territories, particularly among the indigenous tribes, which means if you believe in freedom and democracy, you have to believe and trust in the wisdom of the masses. It reminds me of Ortega Gasset's Rebellion de las Masas, that you must have that trust in the wisdom of the masses and don't ever believe that they can be fooled and deluded at all times. So I remain an incorrigible optimist. I'm still being charged. I'm going back to face trial on the 10th of May. And once you are subjected to a trial, you know for a fact it's a matter of days or months before you get a conviction. Once they prefer a charge, it's a foregone conclusion in that system. And but I have a great family, my wife and children. They are with me, and I believe, again, Malaysians would support this demand and clamor for change and reform. Thank you.